Okay, we might as well begin then. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming to this event. This is held by the Identification of Music Group, and it's powered by the Random Rave Project. I'll be doing the interview. My name's Duncan Dick. I'm the editor of Mixmag, the world's biggest, best, and most beautiful dance music magazine. But most importantly, of course, we're in the presence of a living legend in the music industry. Robin Millar is one of the most successful and revered British record producers in history. His records have won Brits, they've won Grammys, they've brought in hundreds of millions of revenue. He has 44 number ones to his name and 150 gold, silver, and platinum discs. He sold more records than the likes of Jay-Z and Johnny Cash. The artists he's worked with is a huge list. It includes Sade, Randy Crawford, Big Country, Tina Turner, Ultravox, Everything But the Girl, Fine Young Cannibals, Malcolm McLaren, David Gray, Dimitri from Paris, Cassius, Arthur Baker, and of course he produced 2005's Pure Garage Presents the Main Room Sessions.
Hi.
So as is traditional, Robin, thanks very much for being here.
It's a pleasure.
Let's start right at the beginning. Your childhood, was yours a musical home?
Yes, it was a musical home. My dad was Irish. My mum was white West Indian from a local West Indian family. And my dad played the piano all the time. And my mum sang all the time. And we were encouraged to make music and learn music. Yeah.
And you had a very exciting introduction to the music industry itself that actually came through your sister.
Yeah. I think a lot of people here will know that if you are lucky enough to have an older brother or an older sister who's into music that is just out of your reach, at a very important part when you're 13, 14, 15, it can be a life-changing moment. And my sister was into blues and soul, and she completely turned me on to American blues music and American soul music, which I would never have come across on the radio. And then she started going out with a guy, and we were around at his flat, and he came back and he said, I think I've just done an audition for the Rolling Stones, and I think I just got the gig.
Wow.
And so I was 18, and her boyfriend, who then became our husband, joined the Rolling Stones as their guitarist to replace a guitarist who had drowned in a swimming pool. So my first sort of big gig was Hyde Park 1969, which was Mick Taylor's first gig as their guitarist, with me kind of looking on, thinking, if this is what making music for a living is like, I want to do it.
That's incredible. And
yeah.
But you actually were on the spot when they were recording Exile on Main Street in France as well.
I was in France for 9 months during the whole of the recording of Exile, staying with my sister and Mick and turning up to the studio every day. And my tiny little claim to fame is that the first recording, you've got to start at the top, like, you know, you've got to start at the top. My first recording on any sort of record was the original bass on the track Tumbling Dice.
Wow.
And that was purely because Bill Wyman, the bass player, had failed to show up. and Keith Richards always, you know, wanted to spend the day doing something. And you're much more full. I mean, if I think back now, if I wasn't 19, I don't think I'd have said, oh, I can do that. You know, yeah, I can do that. Yeah, no, I'll play the bass.
And was that your very first time in a studio then, going in with the Rolling Stones?
Yes.
And
yes. My first time in the studio was with the Rolling Stones, and my second time in the studio was with George Martin and Paul McCartney.
That is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And I mean, was that when you decided this is the life for me?
I'd been working as a musician, playing the guitar, joined a few bands. I didn't really like being in the spotlight of being in a band, and I just fell in love with recording studios. I fell in love with the atmosphere, the technology, I mean, interesting, we're here talking about the kind of music that you love and that all these guys love. It was the deconstruction of the music It was watching the music being broken down, into its component parts, and then rebuilt. And I had this complete light bulb moment, which is when you're sitting in a studio and you're hearing a track broken down, and the only thing that is playing is, say, the bass drum and the bass. The average 19-year-old in the 70s is not going to understand that that's even possible, let alone that that's how music is built up. So right from the get-go, I had this fantastic opportunity to realize that it wasn't just a bunch of people in a room and they'd set up one microphone and they'd record them all. They would mic them up separately, sometimes record them one after another, and it completely fascinated me. So I tried to get a job in a studio in the UK. I couldn't. I wrote to everyone, couldn't. And so I signed on as an apprentice in a studio in France and worked in a studio for 3.5 years, just learning, obviously learning the electronics and learning the craft of making music. But I think more than anything else, watching people who did it for a living and did it well, and maybe some people who didn't do it so well, and watching them working with the people, getting the performances, using their imagination, manipulating the equipment to maybe do things that equipment wasn't meant to do. And I still have I have a studio, obviously. I've got a studio in London and almost a replica of that studio in Marrakesh. And I still got, I don't know about the people here, but I think we're all drawn to keeping some analog gear, even though we've got great Logic programs. And sometimes it's because you can push the envelope with analog instruments and get them to do maybe things, they start feeding back or they start looping back on themselves, or maybe they'll distort a bit, or you'll, manipulate them in a different way. And I find that more difficult to do just out of the box. I mean, Logic just does what Logic does. Whereas if you impose yourself on analog equipment in a studio, you can end up with the most extraordinary things. And I dare say, if you ask Giorgio Moroder about the process of, how I Feel Love happened, he'll tell you that some of it was sort of trial and error and pushing the gear and using it in a way that it wasn't designed to be used. Stockhausen used electronics in a way that they weren't designed to be used.
If we can just talk about what else was going on in your life at that time. You were told on your 16th birthday that your sight was irrecoverable and in decline.
Yeah.
And I've seen an interview with you where you said you had a year of anger, of cursing, your situation every night before you went to sleep.
Yeah.
How have you been able to turn that rage into, and use it positively? And how long did it take to just come to terms with the situation?
I think it's a process. I don't think I didn't have a sudden sort of overnight going, oh, that's okay, I'm okay now. It happened in degrees. I think I've only got my experience of losing my eyesight gradually over a 20-year period. So I've no idea what it's like losing it overnight. Probably more horrible because you've got no chance to, get used to it. But yeah, grief is the right word. It is, and particularly when you're 16, 17 and you can't drive a car, you can't see in a club, or, you can't see from one end of the club to the other. So it might be one of the reasons why I didn't want to tour and why I found studios a bit like a sort of cocoon, because you're sort of there and you've got all your stuff around you and you can lock yourself away. And in those days, of course, studios had no windows. So not only did I not know whether it was day or night, but nobody knew whether it was day or night. So I think I found that the studio environment became an area in which I could function just as well as other people, and actually in the end function better than other people, because a guy came to see me who worked for me for 5 years when he was young, he's been hugely successful. He's done Arctic Monkeys, Kasabian, Adele. And he said, I still remember, Robin, you used to say to us, don't look at the meters, don't look at the red lights, don't look and see whether it's distorting. Just trust your ears. And he said that he still shuts his eyes when he's setting up a compressor or a line, just trusts his ears. So it was tough. It was tough at the beginning, but it did make me very determined to be successful in a way that I could. I thought, well, I'm not going to be a touring musician, but within this, going back to watching the Rolling Stones, like more than anything else, everyone who watches this little podcast or is here this evening who has got ambition to perform the music that they love in front of other people, there is nothing better than controlling a room and that realizing that you have the power to bring that room up, to hold that room in a certain place, to bring it down, and the more you do it, the better you get. And I think most people will tell you that the experience of doing that in front of 60,000 people, is even better. So not being able to replicate that live, I did and do judge my work on its commercial success. I think of myself as in the commercial music space, and that may sound like I'll make any sort of music to be successful. It's actually the reverse. I just think I just try and be involved in the best music I possibly can, and then try and make it reach as many people as possible.
It was very interesting what you were saying about the importance of trusting your ears. Obviously, in your situation, that's what you have to do. But do you feel that maybe production has become a little bit too visual, especially with software? Sometimes I even hear a DJ play and I can almost see that they're going by the waveforms rather than the feeling.
I use virtual waveforms, so they have their uses, but there are some programs, for instance, that come out. I mean, I do a lot of mastering, for instance, on quite a lot of commercial records, and there are quite a lot of mastering programs that are out now, and you can literally upload your music, and it will analyze the waveform, and it will decide that to conform to being a great techno track or a great EDM track or a great rock track, it'll need this amount of bass, this amount of, so it'll master your record for you. You go, great, that saved me a lot of money. I've yet to find a situation where, without sounding sort of smug, where I've mastered a record for someone and then they've put it through, an automatic mastering program and said, oh, the automatic mastering was better. And I definitely can't see the waveforms. So, I'd say first and foremost, it's almost like a really elemental piece of logic, isn't it? Trust your ears. If what you're hearing sounds good to you, that's the same as everyone else will hear. So don't worry if the waveform tells you it might be wrong or not right. If what you hear is what everyone else will hear.
It would be impossible to try and go through all of your work in the time we have, but I'd love to talk a little bit about the genesis of Sade. And what did you see in them that enabled you to turn them into like a world-conquering group?
Her ambition was very evident. Her charisma was very evident. The tone of her voice was there, right from the very beginning. They were very unstructured. They were basically a funk band. They would just play almost like a 4-bar loop. They'd literally just the bass, drums, keys. They'd play a 4-bar loop, and then she'd sing. And if you actually think about those songs, they are still basically sort of cycles of two chords or 3 chords sometimes. And I thought that it was really simple. I think she could be as good as Marvin Gaye if the song structure was better, and if there was some top line, there was more going on other than just the groove to sort of, turn them into songs.
Did it help that they had a very basic structure that you could build on?
Yes.
Easy to construct.
Yes, and I did construct it in a very kind of traditional arrangement-y sort of way. And I went through literally the songs with them bar by bar and said, this should happen here, and congas should come in here, and we should, I've written a string line that should come in here. And we shared the same sort of musical, background. We loved the same sort of music, so it wasn't difficult. They simply didn't have the experience. They kind of knew what they would have liked to have done, and they just met someone who had the training and the experience to do it. But you've got to remember that I'm not as fluent in this area of music here that we're in the middle of now as anyone in this room. So I've almost got a question to throw back at the audience, really, which is that, when we made those first Sade records, we were at no point wondering or worrying about what else was popular at the time, not in the slightest. Our references were 25, 30-year-old music, but i.e. people who were now 55, 60 years old. But, of course, they weren't. They were 21, 22 years old, so they couldn't play like 60-year-old people. And I think you've got that combination of very young people, playing with that freshness, but trying to evoke those kind of classic records of the day. And, when we'd finished, the record companies did not like the records at all.
Yeah, you had to shop it around for quite a long time.
Yeah, they did not like the records because this was in the very beginning of the time when the Lindrum and the microcomposer and the early Roland sequencers had really taken off. And that were great people, doing great work. So we were sort of up against Depeche Mode, we were up against Yazoo, we were up against Duran Duran, Blancmange, a huge amount of sequence-based music. And the record companies kind of went, you don't seem to understand what's going on around you. And I guess I had a sort of crisis of confidence in a way, thinking, have I really done this band a complete, disservice by doing this? But we were all in agreement at the time. And then this is where the whole commercial thing comes in. When we were chatting earlier, I said that one thing I really feel strongly about is that, first of all, you make the best music you can, but once you've done it, you should do anything possible to draw attention to yourself, because it's commerce. Wear anything, wear your hair any style. Do visual stunts, make amazing videos, do whatever it takes, because as long as the music is good, those are the rules of the game. And if Prince and Michael Jackson and Madonna had to be like that or have to be like that, then you sure as hell have to be like that. And the tipping point was simply that Sade's determination pushed her as a fashion icon in London right at this pivotal moment, and she got her face on the front cover of the very first issue of The Face.
Mixmag's sister magazine.
Yeah. And it said Sade, the face of 1984. And by the way, that photograph, she spent probably 3 weeks with the photographer, cutting, cropping, reshooting, retouching, cropping again, you know what I mean, until she said, that's the image I want. She had 3 images, and she said, those are the only 3 images of me that will come out for the next however long it was. Just those 3, a headshot, a full length, and a sort of side-on shot. And so, she sort of established this image. And then, of course, the record company suddenly had something to hold on to. And 40, 50 years later, I'd say that Simon Cowell learnt that, you know, if you were on television playing a copper in a police show, the public were more likely to listen to your record than if, you know, if you weren't. So sort of getting it, the only difference is that the records are terrible that he makes. Really terrible, really terrible. So he's sort of forgotten the bit about making the records good. So I think, yeah, I mean, do you know, it could have gone either way. It could have just got buried and never come out, and we'd have never known.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that. You've talked about, you know, obviously you make the best possible product that you can make, the best possible track that you can make, but you are then depending on either a happy accident like Sade in the Face, or, you know, a really cunning marketing plan, which is often controlled by somebody else, like a record company. You must have had frustrations in your career where you thought, I've done nothing wrong with this record here, but it's not getting the traction that it deserves. And how do you deal with that kind of frustration and keep pushing for the next one?
What we don't have is what you have in techno and electronic music is you have a barometer. You've got a barometer. You're going out and you're playing live to people all the time, and you'll know whether what you're doing is working or not, and you will make changes to what you're doing. You know, if it's not working. A band can get that exposure and that experience, and it can be really useful. But in a studio situation, if, like me, you're not following the market, you're just taking the band, you know, on its merits, or the artist on its merits. If you were to ask me, and please don't, what are the 4 favourite records you've ever made, Robin? I'd say you will have never heard them, and you'd say, "Oh, you know, test me. I've read up on your career," and I'll say, "You've never heard them because they never came out, because they were probably too good. You know, too good, too interesting. One person accused me of making an album that was too ambitious. You know, this was the head of a record company.
Wow,
This album is
inspiring, isn't it?
This album is too ambitious." And I remember when I handed in the first Everything But the Girl album, Eden, the head of Warner Music rang up and used a lot of really bad language and said, "How can you have delivered Diamond Life and then delivered me this shit?" And I said, "Well, can I remind you that you're one of the people that said that the Sade stuff I was doing was shit a year ago?"
So it's interesting that, you know, you say that trusting your instincts and having the confidence is very important, but also that you don't try and follow the market and don't try and follow trends. But how do you kind of stay aware of what is interesting, what is happening out there, without letting it kind of dominate your own work? You know, how do you keep that balance of reacting to what's going on around you, but not following the market? How I do it is a process where, when I finished a record, I talk to people like you and people like Rupert there, and, you know, lots of other people here, and I say, "Send me everything." I had supper with a friend who lives in Ibiza an hour ago, and I said, "Okay, I'm in receiving mode. I want you to send me two lots of things. I want you to send me the best 6 tracks you've heard this year, and I want you to send me the most successful 6. I'm talking about techno, right? Tracks that are out this year, and I will absorb everything. And it's like stocking up your. It's like plugging your phone in. Do you know what I mean? You can't use it, you know, until you've plugged it up. So I go through a massive period, and then, as Shelley will tell you, who's here, once I start work on a record, I absolutely never listen to anything else at all until I've finished it. Nothing at all?
No.
Not even the radio?
No. Don't turn the radio on. Don't listen to music at home. I'll walk out of a restaurant if it's playing music. I literally totally blinkered. Don't listen to it at all.
Oh, you mentioned there, you know, how you try and get as much input from your friends and people you trust.
Yes.
it's having that community around you to feedback and also to, to expose you to new things. Is that something that a successful producer or someone in the record industry really needs to build for themselves?
I think that's a great question, and I think that the great music makers, DJs, and people that I've ever worked with or come across are people who are obsessed with sharing music. That I do. The great DJs I've met, the great sort of guitar sing, and I'm not going to sort of jump around or I'll fall off the stage into the swimming pool or something, but the people that you'll sort of walk in, you'll say, hi, how, they don't know, come in, you've got to hear this, you've got to, sit down, I've got, and they were like this when they were 14. I was at dinner about 3 months ago, I think Rupert might have even been there, and a woman is a really great agent with CAA, and I'd hardly sat down, and she jammed these headphones on my head and said, we've never met, but I've got to play you this. And if you're like that, you can't help being like that. And I keep those people very close by me. And some of them I've known since I was a kid. Some of them I've met, in the last 10, 15 years. But I keep those people around me. I love them. And they don't just randomly play you stuff. These are people that make endless lists and archive and, you know what I mean, housekeep these endless things, and just it's a complete obsession, and I absolutely rely on them. And I'm obsessive light. I still do it. I still take joy in sharing something, but it'll be less frequent, and it'll usually be in the form of a blog. If someone just plays me something that I think, yes, I'd love to share this.
I just want to go back to this notion of community again. I think there's a kind of narrative around people successful in the creative industries that they're kind of lone, tortured souls that do everything themselves. And do you agree that sometimes we forget how important it is to just be surrounded by people that inspire you? Like the Identification of Music group, for example, just being together with like-minded people and getting their input. No one does. It takes a village. No one has to do everything by themselves.
I do wonder, particularly in the world of electronic music, if you're used to putting your tracks together on your Logic, and then you think that you're going to sort of branch out, and that it's time for whatever reason, either you want to produce because creatively you need to, or you think your career definitely needs your own production work, or maybe you've reached an age where the touring schedule is starting to, punish you, and you just can't do uppers and then downers, every week, 50 weeks of the year. And then you're on your own. And this is a mistake. This is, in order to make that step and make that step successfully, this is when you need to open your doors and open your mind and change as a person, and get used to having other opinions, other influences, because you're sharing music that you're constructing, and the first 20 people you share it with, either because they're collaborating or because they're friends or people you know or trust, will tell you so much about whether what you're doing is working or not. And they can be the strangest people. Sade's had a friend since she was at school, and she appears on the third album under her name, Maureen. And she basically, all I've ever thought about Maureen is that she sits at the back of the room and knits. And she knits, and she reads a magazine like this, and she appears to take very little interest. And then every now and then she'll say, "Is that it?" I said, "What? Is what it? Is that it? What? Is it finished?" I said, "Well, what do you mean, is it finished?" "Well, I mean, is that how you're going to finish it? I mean, it's boring, isn't it?" And thank God, Sade has not gone, do you know, Maureen, why don't you just leave? Because there's a really nice guy with a bag of cocaine, you know, an interesting hat, who wants to sit down there, and I'm much, you know, telling me how beautiful I am. So I'm much more interested in him. So, you know, it's not just, it's supportive friends, but friends who'll be critical. And also, of course, sharing the, production, sharing the actual creativity and getting used to having people around. I mean, I was so lucky to be in a studio. You've got to remember that in the 3 years I spent at the Chateau in France, you know, I was an assistant engineer or engineer on David Bowie's Heroes, Saturday Night Fever, Fleetwood Mac.
Some biggies.
2 Elton John records. You know, worked with Arif Mardin on about 5 records. So I watched amazing people get amazing performances out of people. And then I watched some people who'd managed to get into the studio fail to get amazing productions out of people. And I don't think we want to go into the sort of, you know, any of the details of production, but can I just tell you one short anecdote?
Sure.
I was doing what they call, you know, a master class, and I was talking about working with singers, and I said, I had a singer come up to me last week, and she said, you know, I had a really bad experience last week. The record company sent me in with this producer, and she said, I sat at the back of the room watching the back of his head for 3 days while he fiddled around with his hi-hat and his bass drum and his synths, and he smoked about 10 cigarettes a day, and I was right underneath the air conditioning thing. And at midnight on the 3rd day, he turned around and said, we better get the vocals done. And I got a round of applause from the people in this room. In other words, there were another 30, 40 people who'd experienced exactly that. And if I had one thing to share, really, particularly about if you've spent a lot of time working on your own, preparing your set, then thinking I'm going to go in production, I've got Logic, it's great, I can fiddle around, I've got my own little setup at home. You cannot simply expect just to wheel a singer in and treat them like a kind of annoying but necessary intervention in your precious sequence, because A, it's rude, B, it isn't how they feel about themselves, and C, much more importantly, you will not get a great vocal out of them.
Well, how important is atmosphere in your production process? I mean, we hear stories about Quincy Jones almost torturing Michael Jackson, creating some of the greatest music ever made. But then you promised Ben Watt that you'd make him laugh every day if he came to work with you.
Yes. I will dance, stand on my head, strip down to my underwear. I'll, buy champagne. I'll take them shopping. I'll big them up. I'll talk dirty to them. I'm serious about that. You know what I mean? I mean, my relationships are entirely sort of professional, but I'm quite a method actor. I always sit in the room as close to them as you are to me, and I'll face them, and I'll perform with them, and I'll sing with them, and I'll do the hand movements, and and then I don't torture them like Quincy Jones does, but I will say, okay, hang on a minute. This song, do you want me back or don't you? Because based on the way you sang that, you're not getting me back. And then there's a kind of, and definitely my daughter says to me, Dad, if you could see the look on the faces of people when you say some of the things you say to them, I'm not sure you would dare say them. So maybe this is another advantage of not being able to see, is that I can be very, very candid, and maybe they see something in my face which is not threatening, or not aggressive. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you've looked down the list, but there's a lot of very beautiful men and women in my little, artist roster. And I don't mind them being ugly with me. Do you know what I mean? Uh-huh. I don't mind them putting their head back and, saying, how do you feel? Do you feel like that? Do you feel like that? Well, we'll do that. Go, And more than once in the studio, when I've been working, and there have been quite a few other people in the room, I'll be working with a very beautiful man or woman, and they'll finish the vocal, and I will say, I wasn't really convinced by that. And you can hear this sort of murmuring because they've been looking at her or him, you know what I mean? Like sashaying along with their eyes shut and doing that. And the overall effect, you know, is great. And I'm absolutely convinced it's because of how old I am, and that I knew that the first 25 times the record would get heard would be on the radio before they ever saw the artist.
Yeah.
And if it didn't work on the radio, and
Image doesn't count for anything on the radio.
Totally. And then I'd make a cassette recording of the mix, and I'd go downstairs with Shelley and we'd play it in the car, and then I'd put it on at home on a little system, and I'd go into the kitchen and I'd be doing something else, and imagine I was in a cafe in Buenos Aires and say, you know, the chef's got the radio on. Is that song soaring out of the kitchen? You know, what's that? You know, what's that amazing? You can always remember. God, the first thing I said to Randy Crawford was, I can remember exactly where I was when I heard Street Life for the first time. Exactly where I was. I was walking past a street, and a guy was cleaning his car with the door open, and it was coming out of his car stereo, and I just stopped dead, you know, and just listened to the end of it.
Well, Robin, I'd like to move on to get some of your... I mean, the people who are watching this, a lot of them are aspiring producers, aspiring music creatives, maybe taking their first steps into the music industry.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could just give me some quick tips, or if even just list some schoolboy errors that people should watch out for and try to avoid. Where are the mines in this minefield?
It's a team. You can't do it on your own. You cannot do it on your own. We get back to Maureen, but you know there are more people beside. You need a team of people, whether you want to win the World Formula One Motor Racing Championship or become a successful producer. You need a team of people. You need people that are good at what they do, better at it than how you do it. You need to match that with an enormous confidence in your own ability. You should remember that goodwill will get you everywhere in life, and so you should always prepare to be sort of, you know, generous-hearted, and you should try to give. And very interesting talking to you earlier about the fact that you were focusing very much with Mixmag on some of the more real, the more important things that
The grassroots kind of...
people putting on an event in the Gambia and making sure that there are local, you know, musicians. To your own self be true. Values and a funny sort of word, but integrity. Looking outside of yourself. That means being able to take opinions and, you know, collect great people around you. I think personally, not following the market, but trying to make the market. You know, make the future. Don't try and sort of follow where it's going, but try and make the future. Try and actually finish a record and say, have I ever heard anything exactly like this before? Or you know, are we really in uncharted territory? Because I do have this belief that it'll come around. You know, it'll sort of come and find you eventually. And some of the people that we love the most took a while, you know, to get established. But they're usually established not because they've just made... I mean, we were talking about the Belleville Three, you know, and you imagine how hostile the people around them were when they were 15 years old and bringing music back from Germany and, well, not bringing, you know, they had a friend, didn't they, whose dad, you know, was getting access to music from Germany. So, yeah, I mean, to your own self be true. I don't think I can give you tips about, you know, how to get your music heard, because the gatekeepers have been removed. But if you just think about it, you know, we all get sent records, and I was thinking about this before I came here today, and trying to say this in a way that doesn't sound like an old man talking about those were the days, because in 1970, 68, 70, there were 4 or 5 record companies in England and maybe a few more in America. If you couldn't get your music heard, liked, and signed, that was it. There wasn't any secondary way. There was no internet. There was no YouTube. There was no Spotify. That was it. Now, there were a lot of bad things about that, but what it did mean was that all the stuff that really was third rate just didn't get past the gatekeepers. Okay, so what was left was a competition between people that at least a bunch of 20 or 30 people had decided that the combination of how the artist looked, how they sounded, and whether what they were doing was fresh, was worth putting money into. Now, people think this is great, this is the land of opportunity, the gatekeepers are off. I think for the purposes of the conversation I'm having about make the best music you have, work incredibly hard, be original, collaborate, make something absolutely amazing that just the first 20 people you play it to just go, wow, that's incredible. It's still the way to do it, because the third-rate stuff is still out there. It's now all over SoundCloud. It's all over YouTube. It's all over. So you've still got to, if you think about it, it's an opportunity and a curse, because it means how do you rise above the bubble? And I think people think that this is about apologies, Rupert, I know you're really good at what you do, but they think it's all about being snazzy with social media or having some trick that gets traction, you know what I mean? But actually, Rupert can only do his job of being the best social media person I've ever met by being given fantastic music by a fantastic artist or producer with a fantastic look, and a series of fantastic ideas. That's what he can turn into gold. But it's simply not the case that you can just say, oh, I've just been at home, I've done some stuff on my own, it's great, it's fine, I'll just get some complete whiz with social media and I'll become huge.
And if you genuinely feel that you've created something special, or that you're, on the way there, and other people around you, you're not getting the support that you need, people don't agree, basically. How can people maintain that momentum, and how can they maintain the enthusiasm, and what can they tell themselves?
I had a mum and dad come to me at a school thing and say, we're not sure whether whatever his name was should be doing music. And I said, well, if you need to ask me that question, then I can't give you a sensible answer, because if he's as determined to make music as everybody I've ever known who's got to the top, he won't give a shit what you think about whether he should be doing music or not. He'll just do music, you know what I mean? And if he can't do it one way, he'll do it another way. He'll do it another way. I think that the determination is self-feeding, and I think frustration, if you know it's right for you, frustration should feed it, and it should make it even more, stronger inside you. And the longer it goes on, yes, of course you'll be holding your head in despair. Yes, of course you'll be wondering, how much longer can I do this? But if you keep finding yourself saying, I'm going to give this another 3 months, and then I really am going to qualify as an accountant, or I really, you're okay. You're okay, because you're still doing that thing of, staving off that decision that you simply refuse to make. And the one thing that is great about the area that we're talking in and the audience that we're talking to tonight, it matters a lot less how old you are, and it matters a lot less what you look like now. And that is one fantastic thing about this almost divine area of music is that I can honestly say, never give up, because, I mean, I might even have a shot. You never know if I keep at it.
I think on that note, that's a great sign off for this. That's been tremendously inspiring. Thanks very much. It's a great honor to interview you, and
Pleasure.
we could maybe take some questions from the crowd now, if there are any.
Hi, Robin.
Hiya.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You said you don't have a deep knowledge of electronic music, but what excites you about it enough to be here talking about it today?
I think it's really, really simple for me, is that if you look back at my music, it looks pretty old-fashioned now, but every single record I've been involved in, from when I talked about my very first experiences in a recording studio with equipment that actually they are coming around again. Has anyone here heard of the Eventide harmonizer? Yeah. The early the Watkins Copycat, the Roland Space Echo, the electronic side, and then the very early sequencers. I mean, if I told you how much of the first Sade album was actually feeding bass samples into a sequencer, little bass riffs into a sequencer, resampling bass drums and snare drums to make them consistent. I've always been absolutely fascinated by electronics, and I've got two conflicting things that go on in me. First of all, I'm terribly, terribly sad that the way that the business model of music means that almost all the great recording studios that I either worked in or built over the years have had to close. I mean, 95% of them, because it's not sustainable. On the other hand, the reason it's happened is because Pro Tools and Logic and the laptop has democratized that process. So for instance, I can be in a little area of outside a small town in Zambia, and I can be teaching young disabled street kids how to manipulate electronic sounds and do it well, and then upload it on to the internet, and then I can get a friend who's a top recording engineer based at Electric Ladyland in New York to take that and manipulate it and do something amazing with it. So the reason I'm here is because I think that the power that the multi-track laptop and electronics, and by the way, and how much better the replicas, the universal audios, all the the analog synth, the way you can now harness analog synths to your MIDI sequences in a really sophisticated way. And why I'm here is that when I first started coming to IMS, I was really feeling that the world of sort of rock and pop and the major record companies were getting very stale and very formulaic, and Simon Cowell and his ilk were, had a stranglehold. And I thought that why is the best music no longer the best-selling music? And then I came here and I started attending some of the panels, talking to people, watching people working, and realized that most of the people didn't even touch the mainstream music industry, that they'd just gone on this voyage of discovery, and they'd gone on the same voyage of discovery I did at the same age, which was going to hear music live. And it made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I thought, I'm now in the middle of a place where young people who are not interested in and don't like the mainstream and don't like major record companies go out every night and they hear the music that they love. And 40 years ago, that meant you'd have saved up and bought a guitar and gone to the common room at school, or round to a friend's house, and now you save up and you get yourself a laptop and you manipulate music. So it's a combination of those two things. It's a combination of the fact that the electronic side of manipulating music is what I fell in love with, and secondly, it's you lot. It's you lot. You're the new generation.
What qualities do you look for in an artist you want to work with, in terms of them as a as a person and a professional?
Well, sadly, but honestly, I'd like to say that it was something to do with the sort of qualities that as a record producer I can bring out. And of course, I do believe that sometimes that is all that it takes. But if it's my bank account and my future that I'm going to bet on, it'll be the artist's drive, tenacity, willingness and desire to do anything to achieve. And I say that really based upon experience. And it's hard to make that statement without appearing to be rude. But in a way, I'm not being rude about people. I'm saying that commercial music is commercial music. And, it has to be said that none of the Spice Girls are singers that would have been signed purely on their vocal ability, not by a long chalk. But collectively, what they decided they were hell-bent on doing meant that their vocals were just about okay, just about good enough. And yet there are other people that I certainly wouldn't name that I have been involved in that were 20 times the singer, the artist, the songwriter, the lyricist of the Spice Girls, but they wouldn't come out of their room. Is this answering your question in a way? Yeah. It's so the qualities are not the qualities of their lyric writing or it's their ability to be and embody someone who is going to be a superstar or a star.
Okay,
so
thanks.
That's what I'd look for. I'd look for someone who says, mate, I'm going on this journey. If you want to be on it, it's fine, but I'm on this journey anyway. And I'll tell you, funnily enough, that good record company people will tell you the same. It's people who walk in and sit down with the attitude, you stand between me and success, so please help me, will not do as well as the ones who come in and go, we're going to the top. Do you want part of it or don't you? So it's that's the little thing
Confidence.
that I'd say I look for.
What is the best produced album that you think you've ever heard, and what gave it its star quality?
I think the best produced album that I've ever heard was produced by me. And it's called Paris, and it's by Malcolm McLaren. And I think what gives it its star quality is the contribution that Malcolm McLaren gave to driving me and the rest of the team into areas so far beyond what we'd ever experienced collaborating with an artist. And the extraordinary thing, of course, was that when I say an artist, he couldn't sing, he couldn't play, but he was an absolutely extraordinary, fearless, inspirational, dedicated, hard-working person who demanded the same from all of that. And when I listen back to that record, I simply can't believe how good it is, and I even can't believe how good some of the arrangements and some of the things that I was very directly involved in were. The best two produced albums I've ever heard are firstly Nightclubbing by Grace Jones, which, and the reason I love that is because, and I think this will appeal to all of you here, it's when you consider how long ago that was made, it's a patchwork, it's like the night sky, and if you listen to it with headphones, you will notice that there are dozens of little percussion elements, little keyboard elements, fantastic drumming from Sly and Robbie, and everything's got its own little space, either side to side, top to bottom in frequencies, or front to back. And that's, I studied that record and I realized there are 3 ways you can create space in music: left to right, panning, top to bottom frequency, and back to front with reverb. And if you use all 3 of those like a joystick, you can create 200 times as much space with the same number of instruments. So that's, you know, only great production and that understanding could achieve that. And the other one, of course, for slightly different reasons, is Marvin Gaye. Because it's 1969 and it's a time of huge racial tension, and the sheer magnificence of the production and the atmosphere that those songs like What's Going On and Inner City Blues were imbued with by the producer catapulted that record to #1 in America. A black man in 1969 singing about poverty, inner city poverty, and the unfairness of the situation was bought by 10 million mostly white people who heard it and were simply totally blown away. And of course, they were blown away by the record, and they discovered the politics later. And I think that's a pretty, I mean, I can't think of a better achievement for a record than that.
Okay, well, thanks very much, everyone, for coming to see this talk. Thanks very much to Robin Millar for joining us here in Ibiza, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your IMS.